Warning disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction inspired by urban legends, ghost stories, and fan speculation surrounding the late Karen Carpenter. It does not claim to represent real events and is not meant to defame, exploit, or disrespect the memory of Karen Carpenter or any real person or entity associated with her. The events, characters, and situations portrayed are fictional and intended purely for entertainment. The goal is to craft a suspenseful, eerie narrative that pays homage to Karen's legacy in a respectful and imaginative way. Listener discretion is advised. In the heart of Hollywood, just a few blocks off Sunset Boulevard, stands an aging music studio with a long and prestigious history. Its walls have echoed with the voices of legends: Frank Sinatra, the Beach Boys, and perhaps most famously, the Carpenters. Built in the late 1950s, the studio retains its vintage charm: analog mixing boards, wood-paneled walls, and a grand piano said to have been custom-made for Karen Carpenter herself. But beneath its glittering past lies a darker legend, one that most employees whisper about but few dare to truly explore. Rumors have circulated for decades. Engineers speak of cold gusts that move through sealed rooms. Vocalists claim to hear harmonies being sung behind them, even when recording alone. Security guards, especially the night shift, often report unexplained lights flickering or hearing faint melodies floating through the halls. Most eerie of all, they say that the haunting always begins with the same tune, the first few bars of "We've Only Just Begun," Karen Carpenter's iconic ballad. Studio 3, the room where the Carpenters recorded their early hits, is at the center of the rumors. Some call it a shrine, others call it cursed. No one uses it regularly anymore. Newer artists avoid it entirely, calling it creepy or heavy. A few have even walked out mid-session, claiming to feel watched. Still, the studio owner refuses to close it, perhaps out of nostalgia, or perhaps fear of losing a valuable piece of music history. It's said that shortly after Karen Carpenter's untimely death in 1983, strange things began to happen. A technician allegedly caught a glimpse of her reflection in a turned-off monitor. A singer who once tried to cover her song reported sudden, violent feedback only during that particular track. There's even a logbook entry from 1991 detailing an incident where all the microphones turned on by themselves during the night, recording nothing but silence for 8 straight hours. Of course, skeptics chalk it all up to faulty equipment or overactive imaginations. It's just old wiring, they say. People want to believe in ghosts because it makes the music more romantic. But those who've spent serious time in Studio 3 know better. They speak with lowered voices, rarely making eye contact when sharing their stories. Some refuse to even name her aloud inside the room. Despite the rumors, the studio continues to operate, though most work is now done in the more modern wings of the building. Studio 3 remains untouched, mostly gathering dust. It's used for occasional interviews or photo shoots, but no one dares record in it anymore, at least, not willingly. That all begins to change when a new intern arrives, fresh-faced, curious, and unknowingly stepping into a place where the veil between the living and the dead has grown dangerously thin. Her name is Jenna Reeves. Jenna Reeves was the kind of person who felt more comfortable behind a soundboard than in front of people. At 25, she had just graduated from a respected music production program in Oregon and packed up everything she owned to chase her dream in Los Angeles. Bright-eyed and introverted, she wasn't interested in fame, just in sound. Jenna believed that music had a soul, and she had dedicated her life to capturing it. She had spent weeks emailing resumes and reels to every studio in the city when, unexpectedly, she received an offer from one of Hollywood's oldest recording studios. The job wasn't glamorous, it was an unpaid internship, but for Jenna, working in a place where legends once recorded was worth every unpaid hour. When she got the email confirmation, she screamed in excitement, unaware that she had just been placed in the one studio most newcomers quietly avoided, Studio 3. Her first day was unremarkable. The studio manager, a stern man named Carl, gave her a quick tour of the building. He skipped over most of Studio 3's history, only mentioning that it was one of our oldest rooms and not used very often. Jenna didn't ask why. She was too thrilled just to be there. The main control room had that warm, analog smell, like old vinyl and electric heat, and the console, though outdated, gleamed with polished wood and chrome. Over the next few weeks, Jenna learned the ropes, checking mic levels, organizing cables, cleaning vintage equipment. She was a fast learner and often stayed after hours, volunteering to help with late-night edits or to clean the lesser-used rooms. She was respectful, meticulous, and deeply curious. Her supervisors appreciated her work ethic, but found her habit of staying late a bit odd. Carl warned her gently once, "You don't have to prove anything by working overtime. Especially not in Studio 3. That warning only intrigued Jenna more. One evening, she decided to sneak into Studio 3 on her break. The lights were dimmed, and the air inside felt slightly colder than the rest of the building. She ran her fingers over the keys of the grand piano, surprised by how perfectly in tune it was despite not being played in years. On impulse, she sat down and played a few chords. The sound echoed beautifully, too beautifully. It was as if someone or something was harmonizing with her. As a lifelong fan of the Carpenters, Jenna felt like she had stepped into a time capsule. She imagined Karen Carpenter sitting on the very same bench, recording tracks that would one day define an era. A strange emotion welled up in her chest, part nostalgia, part reverence. She felt like she had found a forgotten temple. From that night on, Jenna began spending more time in Studio 3. She convinced herself it was for practice or exploration, but deep down, she felt drawn to the room. It wasn't just the acoustics or the vintage gear, it was the atmosphere, the lingering presence that made her feel simultaneously comforted and watched. Then the odd things started happening. One night while she was mixing a demo alone, the studio speakers suddenly crackled with static. Out of the fuzz, Jenna could have sworn she heard the opening line to Superstar, faint and distant, as though someone had hit play on an invisible reel. When she checked the console, no tracks were loaded. The playback button had not been pressed. Another time, she left her headphones on the desk and walked out for a coffee. When she returned, the headphones were hanging neatly on the mic stand across the room. She hadn't put them there. She brushed it off, blaming fatigue. But the most unnerving moment came during a late edit session. Jenna was scrubbing through a raw vocal track when she heard a woman's voice softly humming along, not part of the original take. She soloed the track. The hum was still there. Goosebumps ran down her arms. It wasn't a digital glitch. It sounded real. Instead of running, Jenna became obsessed. She began reading everything she could about Karen Carpenter. Articles, interviews, documentaries. She even started visiting fan forums. That's when she found an old post by a former employee who swore that Karen's presence still lingered in Studio 3. According to him, her spirit was searching for closure, left behind by an unfinished melody. Jenna didn't know what she believed, but she felt chosen. As if the spirit of one of music's most tragic icons had picked her an unknown, unseen audio tech to help complete her story. And she wasn't about to let that opportunity go. Jenna didn't consider herself superstitious. She believed in the science of sound, in audio frequencies and waveforms, not in ghosts. But even she couldn't deny that something unusual was happening in Studio 3. The room seemed alive in a way she couldn't explain. There were moments when the air would shift, cold as winter breath, even though the building's heating system was running normally. The lights above the recording booth would flicker sometimes, not like faulty bulbs, but like Morse code, rhythmic and pulsing. And most disturbingly, she started hearing music no one else seemed to hear. It began subtly. One evening, as Jenna cleaned up cables and turned off the monitors after a session, she paused at the door. There it was again, a faint melody, like someone humming. She froze. The melody was unmistakable. We've only just begun. She turned around, half expecting someone to be standing in the recording booth, but the room was empty. The microphone lights were off. The piano was closed. Still, the humming continued for a few seconds before dissolving into silence. Jenna rushed back to the control desk and checked the meters. Nothing was recording, nothing was playing. Her heart thudded in her chest, adrenaline replacing curiosity. And yet, instead of leaving, she whispered aloud into the empty space, "Karen." No reply. The next day, Jenna arrived early. She checked all the studio's wiring, ran diagnostics on the soundboard, and tested the mic preamps. Everything was functioning perfectly. She even recorded herself humming the same melody and tried to compare it. The ghostly version had a softer tone, haunting, almost angelic. That night, she brought in a small lavender-scented candle. Not for summoning anything, just for peace of mind. She placed it near the mixing console, lit it, and began working on a project. For 2 hours, everything was normal. No hums. No flickers. No chills. But as the clock neared midnight, the flame began to bend sideways, despite no open windows or vents. A soft wind, cold and dry, blew across the back of her neck. She spun around. Nothing. But the hairs on her arms stood up, and that familiar humming began again, closer this time. Louder. This time it wasn't, "We've only just begun." It was Rainy Days and Mondays, sung slowly, mournfully, as though the spirit behind it carried the weight of heartbreak. Jenna whispered again. "Is that you, Karen?" And then, for the first time, something responded. The monitors behind her crackled for half a second. Then silence. She looked at the candle. It had gone out. She grabbed her phone and opened the voice memo app, just in case something happened again. She left it recording overnight, tucked beneath the console. The next morning, she rushed to the studio before anyone else arrived. She played back the recording. Most of it was silence, ambient creaks, and the low hum of electrical equipment. But at exactly 3:03 a.m., something whispered. 3 words. "Finish the melody." Jenna's blood ran cold. She replayed it over and over, boosting the gain, filtering out noise. It was unmistakably a woman's voice. Soft, controlled, with a gentle breath behind it. And though there was no way to be sure, Jenna felt something deep in her gut. It was Karen. The perfume came next. A few nights later, as Jenna reviewed archive tapes alone, the studio filled with a sudden, nostalgic aroma. It was a floral scent with a hint of vanilla, feminine, delicate, and decades out of style. It came in a wave and then disappeared completely. Jenna researched it the next day and discovered it matched the description of a discontinued 1970s perfume called White Shoulders, which Karen Carpenter was known to wear. That was the moment Jenna stopped doubting. This wasn't stress or tricks of the mind. Something real was happening. A spirit, gentle, sorrowful, and purposeful, was reaching out. She began writing everything down. Time logs. Notes on each encounter. Patterns began to emerge. The humming only occurred after midnight. The whisper came at 3:03 a.m. The perfume lingered only when she played old Carpenter's tapes. It was as if the spirit was waiting, patiently, desperately, for someone to understand its message. Jenna's obsession deepened. She wasn't afraid anymore. In fact, she felt honored. It wasn't every day that a sound engineer got the chance to collaborate with a legend, living or dead. And she was determined to find out what melody Karen Carpenter needed finished. Jenna's life quickly shifted from late-night mixing sessions to deep archival research. What started as curiosity had now become a mission. She needed to understand Karen Carpenter, not just her music, but her spirit, her struggles, and, perhaps, her unfinished work. The whispers and the chilling moments in Studio 3 felt like breadcrumbs leading Jenna somewhere very specific. She just had to follow them. By day, she continued her usual intern tasks, but by night, she became a detective. She spent hours in the back room of the studio's library, an old, dusty space filled with reel-to-reel tapes, handwritten studio notes, and forgotten session logs. Most people overlooked it, but Jenna treated it like sacred ground. She wore gloves, handled everything delicately, and documented each find with care. She found recording logs dating back to the 1970s, with Karen's initials often written in cursive beside tracks. Some tapes had cryptic labels like KC Alt Vocal, Do Not Use, or Unfinished, Keep Private. She began listening to these forgotten reels with growing intensity. Most were rough takes or vocal warm-ups, but one in particular made her stop breathing. The tape was labeled simply, Casey Melody. Draft 3. She loaded it onto the real player, put on the headphones, and hit play. What she heard was not a complete song, but rather the haunting skeleton of one. Karen's voice, raw, beautiful, and unaccompanied, sang a melody Jenna had never heard before. The lyrics were incomplete, trailing off mid-sentence. There was no background music, just the weight of Karen's isolated vocals, echoing as though reaching out from another world. The final line ended abruptly, when the silence grows, and the stars forget my name, then nothing. Jenna sat there in the silence, heart pounding. She knew without a doubt this was the song, the one the spirit had whispered about. This was the unfinished melody. Over the following days, Jenna dug deeper. She found interviews with Richard Carpenter, Karen's brother, hinting at a private song Karen had written during a difficult period in her life. He had never released it. Fans online debated whether it had even existed, with some calling it Karen's ghost track. Supposedly, she had written it in secret, away from the label and her management, during the final years of her life when she was struggling with anorexia and personal demons. Jenna's obsession only intensified. She searched for lyrics, notes, even fragments of melody tucked into session notebooks. Late one night, while flipping through an old 1978 production diary, she discovered a handwritten page, yellowed with age, folded neatly inside. The lyrics were incomplete, but they matched the ghostly tape almost word for word. Jenna pieced together what she could and transcribed it onto fresh paper. She even began adding her own thoughts to fill in the blanks, always careful to keep the style and mood consistent with Karen's. It was a mournful ballad, an elegy to loneliness, fame, and vanishing dreams. The song didn't cry out for help, it whispered for understanding. The deeper she went, the more emotionally connected Jenna became. She started dreaming of Karen, vivid, emotional dreams where Karen sat at the piano in Studio 3, smiling gently, urging her to continue. In one dream, Karen turned to her and said, "You hear it too, don't you? It's still inside the room." Jenna began to wonder if her growing bond with the spirit had a purpose. Perhaps Karen had been waiting for someone who truly understood music, not just the mechanics, but the soul within it. Someone who would finish the melody not to claim it, but to give it peace. She started experimenting with instrumentation. She used analog gear, just as Karen would have. Every note, every chord was carefully considered. She consulted vocal samples, recreated harmonies, and built the track slowly, layer by layer, using Karen's voice as the guide. One night, while overlaying a soft string section beneath the chorus, Jenna heard a sudden whisper through her studio monitors, clearer than ever before, "You're almost there." Jenna gasped, her hands trembling. She paused the track. Her reflection in the studio window looked different. Not distorted, but softer. As if something was standing behind her, just out of view. It was no longer a matter of belief. The ghost of Karen Carpenter was real. And she was helping her finish the melody. As Jenna grew more immersed in completing Karen's unfinished melody, the energy in Studio 3 began to shift. What had started as gentle whispers and fleeting scents now became more direct, more deliberate. The spirit, once a quiet presence in the background, seemed increasingly eager to be heard. The studio no longer felt like a haunted room, it felt like a place possessed by purpose. Karen's purpose. It began with the dreams. Where previously Jenna's sleep brought vague, blurry visions of Karen at a piano, now they were vivid, intense, and emotionally charged. In one dream, Jenna was seated at the grand piano in Studio 3 while Karen stood beside her, not singing, but staring at her. Her expression was solemn, her eyes heavy with something unspoken. When Jenna tried to speak, Karen reached out and gently touched her wrist. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Even if it hurts." The next morning, Jenna awoke in a cold sweat, and to her shock, a red imprint in the shape of a hand lingered faintly on her wrist. It faded after an hour, but the sensation, that cold, weightless touch, remained with her. Back at the studio, the signs intensified. The lights in Studio 3 began to flicker more aggressively during playback of Karen's vocal tapes. One evening, as Jenna was layering synth pads beneath the chorus, all the meters on the soundboard surged into the red. She quickly muted everything, fearing a power surge, but there was no source, no plugged-in instrument, no overload. And then the monitors turned on by themselves. At first, she thought she had leaned on the button accidentally. But then the screen showed something she couldn't explain, old black and white video footage of Karen singing into a microphone, something Jenna had never seen before. The footage was grainy and incomplete, like a damaged VHS. Karen's lips moved, but there was no sound. Jenna reached for her phone to record it, but the moment she lifted the camera, the screen went black. Shaken, she checked the footage archive. No such clip existed in the studio's digital or physical storage. That night, she received a text message from an unlisted number. It read, "She's waiting in the silence." Jenna froze. No one else knew about her project. She had told no one outside the studio about her work on the ghost track. When she tried to respond, the message disappeared. Determined not to be frightened away, Jenna pushed forward. She resumed working late, isolating vocal takes, blending digital strings with Karen's analog presence. And the closer she came to finishing the track, the more Studio 3 responded, almost like it was breathing. The temperature would drop drastically during harmonies. Certain frequencies caused the overhead lights to dim, as though they stirred something hidden between the sound waves. One night, something extraordinary happened. Jenna was seated at the mixing console, headphones on, polishing the bridge of the song. As she adjusted the EQ on one of Karen's original vocal takes, a second vocal line emerged in the track, one that hadn't been there before. Not an echo, not reverb. A harmony. Karen was singing with her. Jenna pulled off her headphones, heart pounding. She double-checked the file. There was no recorded second vocal. She rewound the track. The harmony was gone. It had only existed while she listened in real time. Suddenly, the studio's intercom crackled to life with no one else in the building. Then came the voice, soft, direct, and close. "Finish it, for me." Jenna stood up slowly. She walked toward the recording booth, each step weighed with anticipation and fear. She opened the door, expecting to find it empty, but something inside had changed. The temperature was freezing. The faint scent of white shoulders filled the air again. And on the piano was a sheet of paper. Her heart skipped. She hadn't placed anything there. With trembling hands, she picked it up. It was a lyric sheet, handwritten, elegant, and unmistakably vintage. The last lines were complete. They matched her own editions, almost perfectly. At the bottom, 3 words were written in faded ink. "You heard me." Jenna realized this wasn't just a haunting. It was a collaboration across time, life, and death. Karen Carpenter's spirit wasn't trapped, she was composing. And Jenna was the instrument she had chosen to bring her final song to life. Jenna now moved with a sense of urgency, as if every hour lost meant drifting further from something eternal and delicate. The message had been made clear. Karen Carpenter was reaching out not in torment, but in need. She had one last melody to share, one final song that had never reached the ears of the world, and Jenna was the bridge between that ghostly creation and the present. The lyric sheet left on the piano became her sacred guide. Though old and worn, it was remarkably intact. The cursive handwriting, neat and flowing, bore a soft signature at the bottom corner, KC. The final verse, the one Karen never recorded, was heartbreakingly beautiful. "When the silence grows, and the stars forget my name, let the echo hold me, in a voice that sounds the same. If this is my goodbye, let it end on a note so true, a song not sung for fame, but only for you." Jenna stared at those words for hours. She compared them to old interviews, Karen's past lyrics, even personal letters archived online. It all lined up. The handwriting, the phrasing, the raw, emotional vulnerability that was signature to Karen's writing. There was no doubt, this was the missing piece. She spent the next week reconstructing the full song. Using a blend of Karen's original vocals from archive tapes and her own instrumentation, she laid out the structure. Verse, chorus, bridge. Soft piano chords in minor tones underscored the sorrow. Warm strings filled the gaps where silence once lived. And in moments where Karen's voice was too fragmented, Jenna added carefully sampled harmonies from live performances to fill the voids without altering the soul of the song. She titled it, Echo of Goodbye. Each night, Studio 3 grew more responsive. The speakers hummed gently when she played the new arrangement. The lights no longer flickered randomly, they pulsed in time with the rhythm. The air still chilled, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt grateful. Jenna began noticing that whenever she played the full track, the room grew still, as if listening. One night, while playing the bridge for the 20th time, she looked into the sound booth and froze. Behind the glass stood a faint figure, a woman in a flowing dress, her hair perfectly parted, her eyes soft and familiar. It was Karen. She wasn't singing or speaking. She was simply watching. Tears welled in Jenna's eyes. She didn't feel fear. She felt a connection, like standing in front of a star one last time before it vanished. Karen nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, before fading into the darkness like a note fading at the end of a song. The next morning, Jenna returned to Studio 3 early, determined to record the final master. She set up everything herself. Analog tape. Vintage microphones. She dimmed the lights, lit the lavender candle once more, and whispered into the air, "Let's finish this." As the song played, something magical happened. The room seemed to swell with emotion. The acoustics were sharper, richer. Jenna's vocals blended seamlessly with Karen's. It was as if time bent in those few minutes. When the final note hung in the air, echoing like a farewell whispered to eternity, Jenna knew it was done. Suddenly, the speakers turned off by themselves. The studio lights glowed steadily for the first time in weeks. The lavender candle extinguished gently, without wind. And the room was silent. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that feels complete. Satisfied. At peace. Karen's ghost hadn't just wanted her song finished. She had wanted to be heard, understood, remembered not for her tragedy, but for the song in her heart that never got to live. Jenna didn't cry. She smiled, quietly, knowing she had helped a voice from the past find its way back to the present, one last time. The studio was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness, but the hush that follows something sacred. Jenna sat in the dim glow of the analog console, her hands still resting on the faders. The final recording session had just ended, but the energy in the room remained suspended, like a breath waiting to be released. The track Echo of Goodbye was now complete. Seamless. Beautiful. A blend of past and present, of Karen Carpenter's voice and Jenna's careful arrangement. It sounded like a time capsule of sorrow and beauty, and Jenna knew instinctively that this was not just a song. It was a farewell. The monitor speakers gave a soft hum, as if satisfied. She leaned back in her chair, letting the last note ring in her ears, but then, just as she reached to power down the system, every light in Studio 3 suddenly dimmed to a faint flicker. And then went out. Total darkness. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes strained in the black, heart thudding as a chill swept through the room like a gust of wind. The air turned icy cold, colder than she'd ever felt before, even in previous encounters. But it wasn't threatening. It felt ceremonial. Then came the hum. Soft. Clear. Distinct. It was Karen's voice, humming the melody of the song they had just finished. But this time, it wasn't a recording. It was live. It was there, in the room with her. Jenna turned slowly toward the glass window that separated the control room from the recording booth. What she saw made her breath catch. Standing in the booth, illuminated by a silvery, spectral light that seemed to come from nowhere, was the unmistakable figure of Karen Carpenter. She was dressed in a simple white blouse and slacks, hair parted and curled just like in her most iconic photos. She looked young, timeless, radiant, but her eyes, those soft brown eyes, held a sorrow so deep and human that Jenna almost wept just seeing them. Karen raised her hand slowly and placed it gently on the glass, as if trying to reach across time itself. Jenna, her body trembling, stood and walked to the window. She placed her hand against the glass too. Their hands aligned perfectly, separated by only a few inches and what felt like decades of history. Then Karen smiled. It was faint, almost shy, but it was real. The kind of smile someone gives when they're finally at peace. The studio remained silent, save for the gentle humming that seemed to resonate through the walls. Karen mouthed a final message. Jenna couldn't hear it, but she saw the words, "Thank you." And with that, Karen's form faded. Not abruptly, not like a horror movie jump scare. She dissolved slowly, like fog lifting from a morning lake, her presence dissipating into the air like the last note of a symphony. The lights returned gradually. The room warmed. And the lavender candle, which Jenna hadn't even noticed had gone out again, relit itself with a soft pop. Jenna stood motionless for several minutes, hands still trembling, heart filled with awe. She didn't need to question what had just happened. Every piece of doubt she'd once carried was now gone. Karen had come. Not for vengeance. Not for fear. She had come to sing. To finish what she started. And Jenna had helped her do that. When she finally sat back down at the mixing console, she noticed one last thing. A message had been scribbled in the margin of her notes, the same elegant cursive handwriting as the lyric sheet. Echoes never fade. Jenna smiled, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She exported the final track to a secure drive, stored the master analog reel, and packed her things quietly. There was nothing more to do. No edits. No polish. The song was done. The ghost had sung her goodbye. And the studio would never be the same. Weeks passed. The days in Studio 3 returned to a strange kind of normal. The cold spots disappeared. The lights stopped flickering. No more whispers echoed through the monitors, and the scent of white shoulders never returned. The room, once electric with invisible presence, now felt still, as though something sacred had come to rest. Jenna continued working at the studio, but she never again stayed past midnight. She no longer felt called to the room in the same way. Studio 3, once haunted by the soft voice of a sorrowful legend, now felt like a quiet memorial, filled with the silence of something completed. But Echo of Goodbye wasn't meant to stay hidden. Jenna faced a choice. She had the finished track, mixed, mastered, and preserved with care. But it bore Karen Carpenter's voice. Releasing it publicly would open a Pandora's box of legal complications and moral questions. She debated it for days. Should she share the song? Should she lock it away forever? In the end, she made a quiet decision. She uploaded the song to a small anonymous music channel, attributing it only as lost tape, tribute to a voice that echoes forever. No mention of Karen's name. No tags. No marketing. Just the melody and a simple black screen. It didn't matter. Within a week, the song went viral. People around the world listened in disbelief. The hauntingly familiar voice, the melancholy lyrics, the pure arrangement, it resonated deeply with fans old and new. Some swore it was AI-generated. Others insisted it was a remix of an unreleased Carpenters track. But a quiet few believed something else entirely. "This doesn't sound like a remix," one user wrote in the comments. "It sounds like a soul finally finding peace." The song was covered by pianists, whispered by singers, and looped endlessly by listeners trying to understand why it moved them so deeply. Music blogs called it the most haunting tribute of the decade. But none of them could explain where it came from. And Jenna never responded to messages or interviews. She had no desire for credit. The studio staff eventually discovered what Jenna had done, but to her surprise, no one was angry. Carl, the gruff manager who once warned her about Studio 3, simply looked at her one day and said, "That room's quiet now. You did something good in there." As time passed, Jenna moved on to other projects, other studios. But she kept a copy of Echo of Goodbye on a small flash drive, sealed inside an envelope, tucked into a notebook. Not for fame. Not for release. Just in case someone else ever heard the whispers. And Studio 3? It was reopened and restored, not as a primary room, but as a historical space. Artists began requesting to visit it, not to record, but to feel. They claimed it held a strange calmness now. A weight, but not a burden. A presence, but not a ghost. as if the room still remembered and was grateful. On the far corner of the wall, just above the piano, a framed lyric sheet was hung by an anonymous hand. Beneath it, etched into the wood, were 3 simple words: "Echoes never fade." And as long as that song existed, neither would she. Karen Carpenter had sung her final goodbye, and the world had listened. 82.